I was standing in my own living room, surrounded by my family, when my daughter-in-law looked around at the worn furniture and faded curtains with that expression I'd learned to recognize over the years, the one that said everything I owned was beneath her, and announced loud enough for everyone to hear that it was selfish of me to keep living in this house when they needed the money so much more than I needed a roof over my head. The room went silent. My son didn't meet my eyes. And in that moment, feeling the weight of every sacrifice I'd ever made crumbling into dust, I understood that the child I'd raised, the boy I'd loved more than my own life, had become someone I no longer recognized. Let me tell you how I got to that moment, dear listener. Let me tell you about the life I'd built in silence, and the family I thought I knew. My name is Margaret, and I'm 66 years old now. For the past 8 years, since my husband Robert passed away, I've lived alone in this modest 3-bedroom house on Maple Street. It's nothing fancy. The wallpaper in the kitchen is from 1987, the carpet in the hallway shows every year of its age, and the porch steps creak in that particular way that makes visitors pause before knocking. But it's mine. Or at least that's what everyone believed. The truth is something else entirely. You see, Robert and I were careful people. We came from nothing, both of us, and we learned early that security doesn't announce itself with luxury cars or designer clothes. Real security whispers. It hides in plain sight. It wears sensible shoes and drives a 10-year-old sedan and clips coupons even when it doesn't need to. Robert worked as an accountant for 40 years. And I taught elementary school for 35. We lived modestly, saved aggressively, and invested wisely. By the time Robert developed the cancer that would take him from me, we owned not just our home, but 4 other properties across the state, rental units that generated steady income through a trust Robert had set up in the early 2000s. No one knew about the trust except Robert, me, and our attorney Gerald Morrison, who'd been Robert's college roommate and the most discreet man I've ever known. The properties were managed through a holding company with a name that meant nothing to anyone who might look it up. The income went into accounts my son Michael never knew existed. To the world, to our family, we were just Margaret and Robert, teachers who'd saved their pennies and owned their home outright. Nothing more. Robert made me promise before he died that I'd keep it that way. He'd seen something in Michael even then, our only child, something that worried him. A softness maybe. An expectation that life owed him comfort. Robert wanted Michael to build his own life, his own character, without the cushion of inherited wealth making him weak. I kept that promise. Even after Robert was gone and the loneliness pressed down on me like a physical weight. Even when Michael and his wife Jennifer moved to town and I ached to help them more, I kept my secret and lived my simple life in my simple house. Michael had always been a good boy growing up. Bright, athletic, kind to animals and elderly neighbors. But somewhere in his 20s something shifted. Maybe it was the private college we'd stretched to afford, or the internship in California where he met Jennifer, or simply the way the world had changed since Robert and I were young. Whatever the cause, Michael developed a taste for things, nice things, expensive things, impressive things. And Jennifer fed that appetite until it became insatiable. They married when Michael was 28. Jennifer was beautiful in that polished, high-maintenance way that requires constant upkeep and unlimited funds. She'd grown up wealthy, accustomed to country clubs and European vacations, and she'd chosen Michael, my Michael, because he was handsome and charming and ambitious enough that she believed he'd give her the life she deserved. For a while it seemed to work. Michael climbed the corporate ladder at a marketing firm. They rented a beautiful townhouse in the nicest part of town, the kind with a doorman and a gym and an address that impressed Jennifer's friends. They posted constantly on social media. Perfect pictures of perfect dinners at trendy restaurants, weekend getaways to mountain resorts, Jennifer's designer handbags arranged artfully on their marble countertop. And me? I was the shabby footnote in their glossy story. The elderly mother who lived in that old house across town, who wore the same coat for 5 winters in a row, who brought homemade cookies to family gatherings while everyone else arrived with catered appetizers and expensive wine. Jennifer was never cruel exactly, just dismissive. She'd pat my hand when I arrived and say things like, "Oh, Margaret, you didn't have to bring anything," in a tone that made it clear my contributions were quaint at best, embarrassing at worst. She'd talk about her yoga classes and her stylist and her latest vacation plans, and then ask about my week with the kind of polite disinterest you show a stranger on a bus. Michael noticed, I think, but he never said anything. He was caught between two worlds, the humble upbringing he came from and the luxurious life he was trying to build. And increasingly, as the years passed, he chose Jennifer's world over mine. The cracks started showing about 2 years ago. Michael's job became less secure as his company downsized. The promotions stopped coming. Money got tighter, though they tried to hide it behind the same expensive facade. But I saw the stress in my son's eyes, the way his smile became forced, the way he'd check his phone constantly during our monthly dinners together as if monitoring something that worried him. Last year, things came to a head. Michael lost his job. It took him 6 months to find a new position, and when he did, it paid 30% less than what he'd been making. They had to give up the townhouse. Jennifer was devastated. She cried for weeks, according to Michael, mourning the loss of her perfect address and perfect life. That's when I made my first mistake, though I didn't realize it at the time. Through Gerald's help and the trust, I arranged for them to rent a house, a beautiful 4-bedroom property in an established neighborhood, the kind of place young families aspired to own. It was actually one of my properties, though they didn't know that. Through the management company, I offered it to them at a rent so low it was almost charity, barely enough to cover the property taxes and maintenance. I told Gerald I wanted to help them get back on their feet. I wanted my son to have some stability while he rebuilt his career. Michael and Jennifer moved in and immediately transformed. Suddenly they were homeowners in their minds, even though they were renters. Jennifer's social media exploded with posts about their house, the garden she was planning, the renovations they'd make someday, the neighborhood barbecues they were hosting. She called it their dream home, their sanctuary, the place where they'd finally build the life they deserved. They never questioned how they'd gotten so lucky with the rent. They never wondered why the management company was so accommodating when they were late with payments, which happened more often than I like to admit. They simply accepted their good fortune as something owed to them by the universe, and went right back to living beyond their means. And me? I stayed in my little house on Maple Street, with my creaking porch and faded curtains, visiting them once a month for Sunday dinner, bringing my homemade cookies, accepting Jennifer's condescending pats on my hand, until 3 weeks ago when everything fell apart. They'd invited me for Sunday dinner, same as always. But when I arrived, I realized it wasn't just family. Jennifer had invited several of her friends as well. Young couples I didn't know, dressed in expensive casual wear, sipping wine on the back patio of the house I secretly owned. I should have left then. Something in the atmosphere felt wrong, felt staged. But Michael had asked me to come, and I saw so little of him anymore that I couldn't bear to walk away. Jennifer held court on the patio, telling everyone about their plans for an upcoming vacation. 6 weeks in Europe, she announced, visiting Paris and Rome and Barcelona. She described the hotels they'd stay in, the restaurants they'd booked, the designer shopping she planned to do. It would cost $40,000, maybe more. She said it like that was nothing. Like money was just something you conjured out of thin air when you wanted nice things badly enough. One of her friends asked how they were managing such an extravagant trip. And Jennifer, with her practiced social media smile, turned to look at me sitting quietly in the corner with my glass of water and said, "Well, we're hoping Margaret will help us out. She's got that house, you know, the one she's rattling around in all alone. It's worth quite a bit, even in its condition. We thought she could sell it and split the proceeds with us. After all, what does she need all that space for at her age?" The moment those words left Jennifer's mouth, something inside me went very still. You know that feeling when you're in a car accident, how time seems to slow down and you can see everything happening but you can't quite make your body respond. That's what it felt like, sitting there on that patio with all those strangers staring at me, waiting for my reaction to what was essentially a demand that I liquidate my home to fund their vacation. I looked at Michael. That's what hurt the most, I think. Not Jennifer's entitlement or her casual cruelty, or even the audacity of asking me to sell my home. It was the way my son sat there silent, looking down at his plate. Not defending me, not correcting his wife, not saying a single word to indicate that he found anything wrong with what she just proposed. Jennifer kept talking, her voice bright and cheerful, as if she were discussing something as simple as borrowing a cup of sugar. She told her friends that my house was outdated anyway, that the neighborhood wasn't what it used to be, that I'd probably be happier in a small apartment somewhere with less maintenance to worry about. She said it would be better for everyone. I'd have less responsibility, they'd have the resources they deserved, And honestly, wasn't it selfish to hold on to so much space when younger people needed it more? Her friends nodded along. One of them even said it sounded like a smart financial move for someone my age. Another mentioned her own grandmother who downsized and was so much happier in a retirement community. I sat there listening to them plan out my life, these strangers who knew nothing about me, nothing about what Robert and I had built, nothing about the years of careful planning and sacrifice that had gone into everything we owned. And still Michael said nothing. I waited. I gave him chance after chance in those terrible minutes to speak up, to remember who I was, to remember that I was his mother and I'd given him everything I had for his entire life. But he just sat there, trapped between his wife's expectations and whatever remnants of conscience he might have still possessed, and he chose silence. So I spoke instead. My voice came out quieter than I intended, but steady. I said that I appreciated their concern for my well-being, but I wasn't planning to sell my house. I said I was quite comfortable where I was and I hoped they'd understand. Jennifer's smile never wavered, but something cold flashed in her eyes. She laughed. Actually laughed. And said I was being silly, that I just needed time to think about it practically. She said we could talk more about it later in private when I wasn't being stubborn. Stubborn. She called me stubborn for refusing to sell my home to fund her European vacation. I stood up then. My legs felt shaky, but I managed. I thanked them for dinner, even though I'd barely touched the expensive catered food Jennifer had ordered. I gathered my purse and my light jacket, and I walked through that beautiful house, my house though they didn't know it, toward the front door. Michael finally spoke as I reached for the handle. He said my name, just Mom. In a voice that might have been apologetic or might have been annoyed, I couldn't quite tell. I turned and looked at him, really looked at him, and tried to find the little boy I'd raised somewhere in the face of this 40-year-old stranger. I told him I loved him. I told him I'd always love him. And then I left. The drive home took 15 minutes, but I don't remember any of it. My body drove on autopilot while my mind spun in circles, replaying the scene over and over, examining it from every angle like pressing on a bruise to see how much it hurt. When I got home, I sat in my car in the driveway for a long time. The house looked exactly as it always had, small, modest, slightly shabby around the edges. The hydrangeas Robert had planted 20 years ago were blooming along the front walk. The porch light I'd forgotten to replace last month flickered intermittently. Everything was the same as it had been when I'd left 2 hours earlier, but somehow the whole world felt different. I'd known Jennifer was entitled. I'd known she looked down on me. But I'd told myself it didn't matter, that as long as Michael was happy, I could endure her condescension. I'd told myself that family required sacrifice, that love meant accepting people's flaws, that my feelings were less important than keeping the peace. But this was different. This wasn't just condescension or casual dismissal. This was Jennifer looking at my entire life. My home, my security, my independence, and deciding it was something she could claim for herself. Something she deserved more than I did. And worse, so much worse, was that Michael had let her. I finally went inside around 10 that night. The house felt emptier than usual, the silence heavier. I made myself a cup of tea I didn't drink and sat at the kitchen table where Robert and I had shared thousands of meals over 4 decades of marriage. Robert would have known what to do. Robert always knew what to do. He'd understood people in a way I never quite managed. Understood their weaknesses, their motivations, the way seemingly small choices could reveal profound truths about character. That's why he'd set up the trust the way he had. That's why he'd made me promise to keep it secret. Michael needs to earn his own way, Robert had told me near the end, when the morphine made him honest in ways he'd avoided while healthy. If he knows about the money, he'll never develop the strength he needs. He'll never learn what actually matters. I'd argued with Robert then. I'd said Michael was a good man, that he deserved to know his future was secure. But Robert had shaken his head, weak but certain. He's not a good man yet, Robert had said. He's a comfortable man, and comfortable men don't grow. Promise me, Margaret. Promise me you'll let him struggle enough to find out who he really is. So I'd promised. And I'd kept that promise even when it hurt, even when I watched Michael make choices that worried me, even when Jennifer came into his life and amplified all his worst tendencies. I told myself I was honoring Robert's wishes, giving Michael the chance to develop character through adversity. But sitting there that night in my quiet kitchen, I wondered if I'd made a terrible mistake. What if Robert had been wrong? What if all I'd done was let my son drift so far from me that he could sit silently by while his wife demanded I sell my home? What if the lesson had failed, and all I'd accomplished was losing the only family I had left? I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed watching the ceiling fan turn, thinking about all the moments I might have intervened differently, all the times I could have been firmer, clearer, braver, all the ways I'd let Jennifer's behavior slide because I was afraid of losing access to my son. By morning I'd made a decision. Not about revenge or punishment, those concepts felt too harsh, too angry, and I've never been an angry person. But about boundaries. About what I would and wouldn't accept. About how much of myself I was willing to sacrifice for people who clearly saw me as nothing more than an obstacle to their desires. I called Gerald Morrison at 9 o'clock. He'd been managing my properties and Robert's trust for 15 years. And he knew me well enough to hear the strain in my voice even though I tried to hide it. He asked if everything was all right. I told him I needed to review the rental agreement on the Riverside property, the house where Michael and Jennifer lived. I asked him about the terms, the notice requirements, the legal process for ending a lease. Gerald was quiet for a moment. Then he asked very gently if I was certain this was what I wanted to do. He reminded me that I'd been subsidizing their rent significantly, that any standard market rate lease would cost them at least 3 times what they were currently paying. He said that changing their situation might create significant hardship for them. I told him I understood. I told him I was certain. And then, because Gerald had known Robert and me for so long, because he'd helped us build everything we had with such care and discretion, I told him what had happened the night before. Gerald listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet again. Then he said something that surprised me. He said that Robert had left him a letter, years ago when they'd first set up the trust, to be opened if I ever called about modifying Michael's living situation. I hadn't known about any letter. Robert had never mentioned it. Gerald offered to bring it to me that afternoon. I said yes. The hours between that phone call and Gerald's arrival felt suspended somehow, as if I were holding my breath without meaning to. I cleaned the kitchen even though it was already clean. I deadheaded the hydrangeas. I reorganized the linen closet, anything to keep my hands busy while my mind raced. Gerald arrived at 2 o'clock. He looked older than I remembered, though I'd seen him just 6 months earlier to sign the annual trust documents. Or maybe I looked older too and we were both just finally showing our age. He handed me an envelope with my name written in Robert's distinctive handwriting. Just seeing those familiar letters made my throat tighten. 8 years gone, and still my husband's handwriting could undo me. Gerald said he'd wait in the living room while I read it. He said to take all the time I needed. I opened the envelope with shaking hands. Robert's letter was dated 3 months before he died, written during one of his last clear periods before the pain medication made coherent thought impossible. His handwriting was shakier than usual but still legible, still unmistakably his. "My dearest Margaret," it began, and I had to stop reading for a moment to collect myself. He wrote that if I was reading this letter, it meant Michael had finally revealed himself. Either as someone who'd learned to value what truly mattered, or as someone who'd failed that test. He wrote that he trusted my judgment completely, that if I'd called Gerald about the Riverside property, it meant I'd seen something in our son that required action. Then Robert wrote something I hadn't expected. He said he'd arranged the rental of that specific property to Michael deliberately, working with Gerald to make it available just when Michael would need it most. It wasn't random luck or coincidence. It was a test, carefully constructed, to see what Michael would do with unearned advantage. If he treats it as a gift to be grateful for, if he uses the breathing room to build something real, if he remembers where he came from and who helped him, Robert wrote, then you'll know our son has become the man we hoped he'd be. But if he treats it as something owed to him, if he becomes entitled and demanding, if he forgets you and his comfort, then you'll know the lesson has failed and stronger measures are required. Robert had known. Somehow, even dying, even in pain, he'd known this moment might come. He'd built in a contingency, a way for me to respond if our son proved unworthy of the gift he'd been given. The letter ended with instructions. Specific, detailed instructions about what Gerald was authorized to do if I requested it. Ways to end the rental arrangement. Ways to ensure Michael and Jennifer would face the natural consequences of their choices without destroying them completely. ways to create struggle that might, even now, teach the lessons Michael had failed to learn through easier means. And at the very bottom, in handwriting so shaky I almost couldn't read it: "Trust yourself, my love. You've always been stronger than you believed. Do what needs to be done. I'm with you always." I sat there holding that letter, reading it over and over, and feeling Robert's presence so strongly it was almost like he was sitting beside me at the kitchen table the way he had thousands of times before. He'd known I would struggle with this. He'd known I would doubt myself. So he'd left me this gift: permission, guidance, and the strength to do what I couldn't quite do on my own. I walked into the living room where Gerald waited. I handed him back the letter and told him I wanted to proceed. I wanted to terminate the rental agreement according to whatever terms gave Michael and Jennifer the legally required notice, but no more. I wanted the property returned to market rate for future tenants. And I wanted all of this done through the management company without revealing my ownership. Gerald nodded. He said he'd have the papers drawn up by end of business. He asked one more time if I was certain. I thought about Michael's silence, about Jennifer's casual cruelty, about years of condescension I'd endured in the name of keeping peace, about the little boy I'd raised and the man he'd become, and the fact that sometimes loving someone means letting them face the consequences of their choices. I told Gerald I was certain. After he left, I sat in Robert's old armchair by the window, looking out at our street, at the life we'd built here, at all the simple, solid, real things that constituted true security. And for the first time since that awful dinner 2 days ago, I felt something like peace. The notice was delivered to Michael and Jennifer exactly 1 week after that terrible dinner. 60 days to vacate the property, signed by Riverside Property Management LLC, citing the owner's decision to take the house off the rental market for personal use. Standard language, nothing unusual, nothing that would raise suspicions about who had actually made the decision. I didn't call Michael during that week. He didn't call me either. The silence between us stretched out like a chasm neither of us seemed willing or able to cross. I told myself I was giving him time to think, to perhaps realize what Jennifer had asked of me and feel some shame about his silence. But truthfully, I think I was afraid. Afraid he'd apologize in a way that wasn't sincere, or worse, that he wouldn't apologize at all. Gerald called me the day after the notice was delivered. He said Michael had contacted the property management company within hours, asking if there was any way to negotiate, to stay longer, to purchase the property perhaps. The management company had responded professionally but firmly. No negotiations, the owner's decision was final. 60 days was all they had. I asked Gerald if Michael had sounded upset. Gerald hesitated, then said upset wasn't quite the right word. Panicked might be more accurate. I should have felt satisfaction at that, or vindication, or some sense of justice being served. Instead, I felt hollow, because panic in my son's voice, even secondhand through Gerald's description, still hurt me. Even now, even after everything. 2 days later, Jennifer called. Not Michael, Jennifer. I almost didn't answer. Her name on my phone screen made my stomach clench. But curiosity won out, or maybe habit, or maybe some small foolish hope that she was calling to apologize. She didn't apologize. Her voice was tight, strained in a way I'd never heard before. She said they'd received notice to leave their house, their home she called it, as if saying it that way would make it true. She said it was a disaster, that they couldn't possibly find another place as nice in their budget, that the rent on comparable properties was outrageous. She said they'd been counting on staying there for years, that they'd made plans around that stability. I listened without speaking. I wanted to hear what she'd say next, whether she'd remember at all what she'd asked of me just 9 days earlier. She didn't mention it. Not directly. Instead, she said they needed help. She said family was supposed to help family in times of crisis. She said if I could just loan them the down payment for a house purchase, they'd be able to buy something and wouldn't have to worry about landlords ever again. $20,000, maybe 30. Surely I could manage that. Surely I wouldn't want to see them homeless. Homeless. She actually used that word, as if there weren't 1,000 rental properties in our city, as if they were facing destitution rather than simply losing access to a house they'd been paying far less than it was worth. I asked her, keeping my voice carefully neutral, if she remembered our conversation at dinner the previous week, the one where she'd suggested I sell my home to fund their vacation. There was a pause. Then Jennifer laughed. A short, brittle sound with no humor in it. She said that was completely different, that my house was just sitting there while I rattled around in it alone, while their situation was actually urgent. She said surely I could see the difference. I could see the difference, I told her. I could see it very clearly. Then I said I wouldn't be providing them with any money, for a down payment or anything else. I said I hoped they found a solution to their housing situation, but it wouldn't involve me. Jennifer's voice changed then. The pleading tone vanished, replaced by something colder, sharper. She said I was being cruel. She said I was punishing them for being honest about their needs. She said Michael had always said I was difficult, and now she finally understood what he meant. That landed like a physical blow. Michael had said I was difficult. To his wife. In private conversations I'd never been part of. He'd characterized me as a problem to be managed rather than a mother to be loved. I told Jennifer I had to go. I hung up before she could respond, my hands trembling so badly I nearly dropped the phone. For a long time I just sat there, staring at nothing, feeling the weight of that revelation. My son thought I was difficult. After everything I'd done, every sacrifice I'd made, every moment I'd held my tongue to keep the peace, he'd labeled me as the difficult one. Michael called that evening. It was the first time I'd heard his voice since the dinner, and despite everything, my traitorous heart still leaped a little at his name on the screen. His voice was strained, exhausted. He said Jennifer had told him about their conversation. He said she was upset that I'd hurt her feelings. Then, almost as an afterthought, he said they really were in a tough spot with the house, and if there was anything I could do to help, he'd appreciate it. If there was anything I could do. As if I were a distant acquaintance rather than his mother. As if he were asking me to help him move furniture rather than fund his life. I asked him, and I'm proud that my voice stayed steady, if he remembered what Jennifer had said at dinner about me selling my house. He sighed. Actually sighed like I was being tedious by bringing it up. He said Jennifer hadn't meant it the way it sounded, that she was just thinking out loud about options, that I was taking it too personally. Taking it too personally. My daughter-in-law had suggested I sell my home to fund their vacation, in front of strangers, while my son sat silent, and I was taking it too personally. I asked him why he hadn't said anything that night. Why he just sat there while she talked about my house like it was something they could liquidate for their convenience. Another pause. Then he said he'd been trying to keep the peace. He said Jennifer was stressed about money and sometimes said things she didn't mean. He said he'd planned to talk to her about it later privately, but then I'd left so abruptly and made everything awkward. I'd made everything awkward. Not Jennifer's demand. Not his silence. My departure, my refusal to sit there and accept their plans for my life, that was the awkward thing. Something crystallized in that moment. A clarity I hadn't quite achieved before. This wasn't just about one dinner or one terrible request. This was about who my son had become when I wasn't looking. Someone who prioritized his wife's comfort over his mother's dignity. Someone who saw boundaries as awkwardness and self-advocacy as difficulty. Someone who'd learned to expect, to take, to assume that my resources existed for his benefit. I told him I loved him. I told him I would always love him. But I also told him I wouldn't be helping with their housing situation, and I wouldn't be discussing it further. He tried to argue. He said I was being unreasonable, that this was what family did for each other, that he'd never asked me for much. I let him talk until he ran out of words, and then I said goodbye and ended the call. The next few weeks were strange. Quiet. I didn't hear from Michael or Jennifer at all, which somehow hurt even though it was exactly what I'd expected. I imagined them scrambling to find a new place, dealing with the reality of market rate rents, perhaps for the first time understanding what their housing had actually been costing someone else. Gerald kept me informed. They'd found an apartment. Much smaller, less prestigious neighborhood, rent that would stretch their budget uncomfortably thin. They'd be moving in 2 weeks before their 60-day notice expired. They'd put most of their furniture in storage because it wouldn't fit in the new space. I asked Gerald if the management company had found new tenants for the Riverside property. He said they had, a young family, 2 teachers with 3 children, who'd been searching for something affordable in a good school district for months. They'd been thrilled to find it. They'd paid the deposit immediately and would move in the week after Michael and Jennifer moved out. That detail pleased me more than it probably should have. Teachers. Like Robert and I had been. People who worked hard and deserved a stable home. People who'd be grateful for what they had rather than demanding more. I drove past the Riverside property one afternoon, 3 days before Michael and Jennifer were scheduled to move. I don't know what compelled me to do it. Morbid curiosity, maybe, or a need to see with my own eyes what was happening. The moving truck was already there. I watched from down the street as they carried boxes out, furniture wrapped in blankets, all the accumulated stuff of their life together being packed away. Jennifer stood on the front lawn directing the movers, her face drawn and tired. Michael carried boxes with his head down. His shoulders slumped in a way that made him look older than 40. I watched my son load his life into a truck and move away from the home I provided without his knowledge, and I felt something complicated and painful that I couldn't quite name. Relief, maybe. Sadness. Guilt. Determination. Love and disappointment so tangled together I couldn't separate them. This was what Robert had wanted me to do. What he'd prepared for, planned for, left instructions for. Let Michael face consequences. Let him learn through struggle what comfort had failed to teach him. But Robert wasn't here to see it, to tell me if I was doing it right, to hold me when the weight of it became too much. Robert was 8 years in the ground and I was alone watching our son suffer, wondering if this was wisdom or cruelty or some terrible mixture of both. I drove away before they could see me. I went home to my modest house with its creaking porch and faded curtains, and I made myself a cup of tea, and I tried to believe I'd done the right thing. The first month after Michael and Jennifer moved into their apartment, I heard nothing from them at all. Not a phone call, not a text message, not even a bitter email. The silence was absolute, and it carved a hole in my daily life that I tried very hard not to notice. I'd spent 8 years as a widow learning how to be alone, learning how to fill my days with purpose and routine and small pleasures that belonged only to me. I thought I'd mastered loneliness, but this was different. This was the loneliness of estrangement, of knowing my son was out there somewhere, angry with me, struggling, and choosing not to reach out. This was the loneliness of a door closed from the other side. I kept myself busy. I volunteered at the library on Tuesday mornings, reading to children whose parents worked early shifts. I tended my garden with more attention than it probably needed. I called my older sister in Vermont every Sunday, though I never quite managed to tell her what had happened with Michael. The words stuck in my throat every time I tried. Gerald called occasionally to update me on the Riverside property. The new tenants were wonderful, he said. They'd asked permission to plant vegetables in the backyard, to repaint their daughter's bedroom a cheerful yellow. They paid rent on time, treated the house with respect, sent thank you notes through the management company for how well-maintained everything was. Each update made me feel both better and worse. Better because the house was being appreciated, worse because it highlighted everything Michael and Jennifer had taken for granted. I found out about the Unraveling through Helen Cartwright, of all people. Helen was a former teaching colleague who'd retired the same year I did, and we met for coffee once a month to catch up and complain about how the world had changed. She was a terrible gossip, which normally annoyed me, but that particular Tuesday in late November, her gossip was the only reason I learned what was really happening with my son. Helen had run into Jennifer at the grocery store. She told me this with barely contained glee, the way she always shared news of other people's misfortunes. She said Jennifer had looked awful. No makeup, yoga clothes that looked like she'd slept in them, hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. Not at all like the polished, perfect woman who usually inhabited every public space like she owned it. Helen had asked how she was doing, and Jennifer, perhaps too exhausted to maintain her usual facade, had actually told her. They'd had to sell Jennifer's car. The luxury SUV she'd leased for more than Michael's old sedan cost to buy outright. The apartment was costing them more than they'd expected once utilities were factored in. Jennifer had taken a part-time job at a boutique to help make ends meet, which she clearly considered a humiliation. Michael was working longer hours, trying to prove himself valuable enough for a promotion that might never come. And the vacation, the European trip that had started all of this, was canceled, of course. Not postponed. Canceled. Jennifer had told Helen this with what sounded like genuine grief, as if she were mourning an actual loss rather than the absence of a luxury she'd never earned. But the detail that caught Helen's attention most, the one she repeated with particular emphasis, was about their marriage. Jennifer had apparently said, right there in the produce section, that she and Michael were fighting constantly. that Michael blamed her for their housing situation, though Jennifer couldn't understand why. That he'd said something about how his mother had been right about them all along, whatever that meant. I listened to Helen's gossipy recitation with my coffee growing cold in my hands, feeling something I hadn't quite felt before. Not satisfaction exactly, not even vindication, more like witnessing. Like I was finally seeing the true cost of the choices they'd made. The bills coming due, the reality that had been hidden behind their careful social media facade. Helen asked if I knew what Michael had meant about me being right. I said I didn't want to discuss it. Helen looked disappointed but moved on to other topics, other gossip, other people's troubles to dissect over coffee and biscotti. I went home that afternoon and did something I'd been avoiding for weeks. I looked at Jennifer's social media. The change was stark. Where there had once been daily posts, artfully arranged meals, designer bags, vacation planning, inspirational quotes about living your best life, there was now near silence. The last post was from 3 weeks earlier, a vague statement about how true happiness comes from within, decorated with sunset emojis and hashtags about authenticity. The posts before that told a story if you knew how to read between the lines. The complaints about landlords hiding as humorous memes. The rants about how hard it was to find quality housing in their price range. The sudden interest in minimalism and how freeing it was to downsize. Each post was a small surrender disguised as a choice, a loss reframed as a lifestyle decision. But it was the comments that really showed me what was happening. Friends asking if everything was okay. Acquaintances noting they hadn't seen Jennifer at the usual places, the yoga studio, the wine bar, the weekend farmer's market. And just a few that had a sharper edge. People who'd noticed the gap between Jennifer's former lifestyle and her current reality, who were perhaps taking some pleasure in the fall from grace. I closed the app feeling vaguely sick. There was no joy in this for me. No triumph in watching my son's marriage strain under pressure they'd brought on themselves. I'd wanted them to learn responsibility, to face consequences, to understand the value of what they'd been given. I hadn't wanted them to suffer. But maybe that was naive. Maybe you couldn't learn the lessons Robert had wanted Michael to learn without some suffering. Maybe that was the entire point. December arrived with early snow. The house felt colder than usual. Or maybe I was just feeling my age more acutely. I put up a small Christmas tree for the first time since Robert died. I'd skipped it in previous years, unable to bear the memories. But this year the empty living room seemed to demand something, some acknowledgement of the season. I bought presents for Michael and Jennifer anyway. I couldn't seem to help myself. A warm scarf for Michael, the kind he'd admired years ago. A book for Jennifer about sustainable living, which seemed both genuine and perhaps a little pointed. I wrapped them carefully and addressed the package to their new apartment, then left it sitting on my dining room table for days, unable to decide whether to mail it. The decision was made for me when Michael finally called 2 weeks before Christmas. His voice sounded different. Tired. Older. He asked if he could come by to talk. Not Jennifer, just him. He said he had some things he needed to say. I told him yes. I told him to come the next evening around 7. I didn't ask what he wanted to talk about. I was afraid to hope, and afraid to prepare for more disappointment. He arrived exactly on time, which was unlike him. Michael had become perpetually late in recent years, always overscheduled, always rushing from one thing to another. But that night he stood on my porch at 7 o'clock precisely, looking nervous in a way I hadn't seen since he was a teenager. I let him in. I offered coffee, which he accepted. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd read Robert's letter, where I'd made the decision that had led to all of this, and for a long moment neither of us spoke. Finally, Michael said he'd been doing a lot of thinking. He said the past few months had been the hardest of his life. He said he'd been angry at first, angry at the landlord who'd evicted them, angry at the economy, angry at circumstances he'd felt were beyond his control. He blamed everyone, he said, including me. He stopped and looked at me directly. He said Jennifer had told him about calling me for money, about my refusal to help. He said she'd framed it as cruelty on my part, as me being difficult and unsupportive, and he believed her at first. He'd let himself believe that his housing crisis was somehow my fault for not rescuing him from it. But then, living in that small apartment, working extra hours, watching Jennifer struggle with her reduced circumstances, selling things they thought they needed, learning to budget in ways they never had before. Something had shifted. He'd started to remember things. Conversations with his father before he died about character and responsibility and earning what you had. Moments from his childhood when I'd said no to things he wanted, not because we couldn't afford them, but because he hadn't earned them. Lessons he'd thought were old-fashioned, irrelevant, maybe even cruel. He was starting to understand, he said, that those lessons might have been love. I felt tears starting and blinked them back. I asked him what Jennifer thought about all this. His face tightened. He said Jennifer was struggling more than he was. She'd grown up with so much, expected so much, and this reduction in circumstances felt like a personal failure to her. They were in counseling now, he said, trying to figure out if their marriage could survive this. I asked very gently if he thought it should. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said he didn't know. He said he loved her. But he was learning that love wasn't enough if you didn't share the same values. He was learning at 40 years old that comfort and happiness weren't the same thing. That the life he'd been trying to build was exhausting precisely because it was built on sand. We talked for 2 hours that night. Not about money or houses or the immediate crisis, but about deeper things. About what Robert had tried to teach him. About the choices Michael had made and why he'd made them. About what kind of man he wanted to be versus what kind of man he'd become. When he finally left, close to midnight, he hugged me at the door. A real hug, tight and long, the kind I hadn't gotten from him in years. He said he was sorry. He said he'd been a terrible son. He said he was going to do better. I told him I loved him. I told him I'd always loved him. I told him that it was never too late to become who you were meant to be. After he left, I sat in the quiet house and cried. Deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from somewhere I'd been keeping locked and guarded. I cried for the lost years, for the pain we'd both endured, for the hard lessons that had cost us so much. But underneath the grief was something else. Something that felt almost like hope. Winter deepened, and with it came a kind of quiet transformation I hadn't expected. Michael started visiting regularly, every Sunday afternoon, just him, no Jennifer. We'd have tea and talk, real talk, the kind we hadn't managed in years. He told me about his week, his struggles at work, the marriage counseling sessions that were proving harder than he'd anticipated. And slowly, carefully, he started asking me about my life too. Not the surface details he'd always glossed over before, but real questions. What did I do with my days? Was I lonely? What had it been like after Dad died? I found myself telling him things I'd kept private for years. How the first year of widowhood had been so dark I sometimes wondered if I'd survive it. How I'd learned to find joy in small things. The garden, the library, children, the quiet satisfaction of a well-made meal for one. How independence, once I'd adjusted to it, had become something precious rather than something to endure. He listened in a way he never had before. Really listened, without checking his phone or planning his next words. One Sunday in January he asked me about the house. Not about selling it, not about its value, but about what it meant to me. Why I'd chosen to stay here rather than downsize like Jennifer had suggested. I told him about the hydrangeas his father had planted, how they bloomed every summer and made me feel like Robert was still here somehow. I told him about the marks on the doorframe in the hallway where we'd measured his height every birthday until he turned 18. I told him about the bedroom upstairs that still had his old posters on the walls, the desk where he'd done his homework, the window he'd climbed out of once when he was 16 to meet friends and thought I didn't know. I told him this house wasn't just a structure with a certain square footage and market value. It was the physical embodiment of a life built carefully over decades. It was memory made solid. And no amount of money, no European vacation, no bigger house or better address could possibly be worth trading that away. He cried. My 40-year-old son sat at my kitchen table and cried, and said he was sorry, and said he hadn't understood. He said Jennifer still didn't understand, that this was one of the main things they fought about in counseling. She couldn't grasp why someone would choose sentimental value over financial opportunity. She saw his changing perspective as him choosing me over her, rather than him simply growing into someone new. I asked him carefully if his marriage was going to survive this. He said honestly he didn't know. He said he was changing faster than Jennifer seemed willing or able to change. He said he was starting to realize they might have built their entire relationship on shared superficial desires rather than shared values. And values, he was learning, were what mattered when life got hard. In February, something unexpected happened. Michael got promoted. Not the big promotion Jennifer had been pushing him toward. Not a corner office or impressive title, but a solid step up with a meaningful raise. Enough to breathe easier, to save a little, to stop living quite so close to the edge of financial disaster. He called to tell me, his voice bright with pride. But the pride wasn't about the money, he said. It was about earning it. His boss had promoted him because of his work ethic over the past months, his willingness to take on extra projects, his reliability. Michael said it felt different than promotions he'd gotten before, which had seemed to come from charm and politics more than actual merit. This one he'd worked for. This one he'd earned. I told him I was proud of him, and I meant it in a way I hadn't been able to mean it in years. Jennifer's response to the promotion, according to Michael, was complicated. She was relieved about the money, of course, but she'd immediately started planning how they could use it to move to a better apartment, to restore some of their former lifestyle. Michael said he'd surprised himself by saying no. He'd told her they needed to save, to build an emergency fund, to be more careful with money. They'd fought about it for days. The counselor had asked Jennifer what she was really afraid of. After a long silence, she'd admitted she was afraid of being ordinary, afraid of being invisible, afraid that without the right house and the right clothes and the right lifestyle, she wouldn't matter. She'd built her entire identity on external markers of success, and without them, she didn't know who she was. Michael told me this with a kind of sad compassion I wouldn't have expected from him months earlier. He said he understood Jennifer better now, understood the fear that drove her, but he also couldn't live that way anymore. He couldn't spend his life chasing after enough to satisfy a hunger that was never really about money at all. As winter turned to spring, I found myself changing too. The quiet life I'd built in the years since Robert's death had been about survival, about getting through each day, about not expecting too much from the future. But Michael's transformation sparked something in me. If he could change at 40, perhaps I could too at 66. I started saying yes to things I'd been declining for years. When Helen invited me to join her book club, I went. When the library asked if I'd be interested in teaching a writing workshop for seniors, I agreed. When my neighbor, a widow around my age named Patricia, suggested we start walking together in the mornings, I showed up at 6:30 with my tennis shoes on. Patricia became a genuine friend, the first close friend I'd made since Robert died. We talked about everything during those morning walks. Our late husbands, our complicated relationships with our adult children, our fears about aging, our stubborn determination to make these last decades matter. She made me laugh in ways I'd forgotten I could laugh. She reminded me that life wasn't over just because you'd lived most of it already. One morning in April, walking past the Riverside property, I told Patricia the whole story. About the trust, about the properties Robert and I owned, about how I'd been secretly subsidizing Michael and Jennifer's rent, about the demand that I sell my house, about Michael's silence, about the decision I'd made to end their lease. All of it, everything I'd been holding private for months. Patricia listened without interrupting. When I finished, expecting judgment or shock, she simply said, "Good for you." I must have looked surprised because she laughed and said it again. "Good for you, Margaret. You stood up for yourself. You set a boundary. You let your son face consequences instead of rescuing him. That's not cruelty, that's love. The hard kind that actually helps." I'd been carrying so much guilt about it, so much uncertainty about whether I'd done the right thing. Patricia's matter-of-fact approval, her absolute certainty that I'd acted appropriately, released something in me I hadn't realized I was holding. That afternoon I called Gerald. I asked him about the other properties in the trust, the ones Michael still didn't know about. 3 rental units and a small commercial space, all generating steady income. I asked what would happen to them eventually after I was gone. Gerald said that according to the trust documents Robert had established, everything would go to Michael. The properties, the accumulated income, all of it. Robert had structured it as a kind of long-term lesson. Michael would struggle now, learn to build his own life, develop character and work ethic. And then, after I passed, he'd inherit wealth he hadn't known existed. By then, Robert had reasoned, Michael would have the wisdom to handle it properly. I asked Gerald if we could modify the trust slightly. I wanted to add a provision that would give Michael the option to convert one of the properties into affordable housing for teachers or other essential workers. Something that would continue the values Robert and I had lived by. Something that would remind Michael, even after I was gone, what actually mattered. Gerald said we could do that. He said Robert would have loved the idea. In May, Michael told me he and Jennifer had separated. Not divorced yet, but living apart while they figured things out. Jennifer had moved in with her parents, unwilling to stay in the small apartment that represented everything she'd lost. Michael had stayed, saying it felt honest somehow. Real. Like his life finally matched who he actually was rather than who he'd been pretending to be. He seemed lighter somehow, despite the pain of a failing marriage. He'd started running in the mornings, lost some weight, smiled more easily. He told me he'd been reading philosophy, history, books about meaning and purpose. He said he felt like he was waking up after years of sleepwalking through his own life. One Sunday in late May, sitting in my garden while the hydrangeas prepared to bloom, Michael asked me how I'd stayed strong all these years. How I'd managed after Dad died. How I'd known what to do when he and Jennifer had demanded so much. I told him the truth. I said I hadn't felt strong at all. I said I'd been terrified, uncertain, racked with guilt and doubt. But I'd had Robert's letter, Robert's instructions, Robert's certainty even from beyond the grave that some lessons require difficulty to learn. And more than that, I said I'd finally learned that love didn't mean saying yes to everything. Sometimes love meant saying no. Sometimes love meant letting people struggle because the struggle was what would save them. Michael nodded slowly. Then he said something that made my heart full in a way it hadn't been in years. He said, "I'm glad you're my mother. I'm glad you loved me enough to let me fail. I'm glad you're teaching me, even now, what it means to be strong." I reached for his hand across the garden table, and we sat there in comfortable silence, watching the late afternoon sun paint everything golden, and I knew finally, fully, that I'd made the right choice. Summer arrived with unusual gentleness that year, as if the world itself understood that healing required time and care. The hydrangeas bloomed more abundantly than they had in years, their heavy blue heads nodding in the breeze like old friends offering approval. I spent my mornings in the garden, my afternoons at the library, my evenings reading on the porch while fireflies emerged in the twilight. It was a simple life, the kind Jennifer would have called boring, but it felt rich to me in ways I couldn't quite articulate. Michael came by most Sundays still, but now sometimes he'd come during the week too, just to help with small tasks around the house. Fixing a leaky faucet, trimming the hedges, replacing the porch boards that had finally rotted through after 40 years. We'd work side by side without talking much, and the silence was comfortable, companionable. The silence of two people who'd found their way back to each other after a long journey through darkness. He told me in July that the divorce papers had been filed. Jennifer wanted it done quickly, cleanly, so she could move on. She'd met someone else, Michael said. A man who worked in finance, who had the kind of lifestyle she'd always wanted. She seemed happier already, according to mutual friends. Michael told me this without bitterness, which surprised me until I realized he'd genuinely let her go. He wished her well. He hoped she'd find what she was looking for, even if he no longer believed it was something that could actually be found in houses or vacations or other people's admiration. He'd started seeing someone himself, he told me shyly. A woman named Sarah who worked as a nurse at the county hospital. They'd met at a community garden where they'd both volunteered. She grew tomatoes and taught him about composting. They went hiking on weekends, cooked simple meals together, talked about books and ideas and what made life meaningful. He said it felt completely different from what he'd had with Jennifer. Quieter, steadier, more real. I met Sarah in August. She came to Sunday dinner, bringing homemade bread and a bouquet of wildflowers from her garden. She was lovely in an understated way, freckled and sun-weathered, with laugh lines around her eyes and dirt under her fingernails that she'd apologized for but couldn't quite scrub away. She asked me about teaching, about Robert, about my garden. She listened to my answers like they actually mattered. When she and Michael looked at each other, I saw something I'd never quite seen in his marriage to Jennifer. Mutual respect, genuine affection, a sense of partnership rather than performance. After they left that evening, I sat on my porch and cried again, but this time they were different tears. Relief maybe, joy, the particular happiness that comes from watching someone you love finally find their way home to themselves. In September, 2 years after that terrible dinner that had started everything, Gerald called with unexpected news. The Riverside Properties tenants, the teacher family who'd moved in after Michael and Jennifer left, had asked about the possibility of purchasing the house. They'd been saving carefully, had secured financing, and wanted to make an offer. They'd fallen in love with the place, with the neighborhood, with the schools their children attended. They wanted to make it permanent. Gerald asked what I wanted to do. The property had been a good investment, generated reliable income. But hearing the hope in his voice when he described the family's offer, I knew what Robert would have said. Some things mattered more than return on investment. I told Gerald to accept their offer, but at a price below market value, enough that they could afford it comfortably, build equity, have the security of ownership. I told him to structure it so they'd never know about the discount, so it would just seem like they'd negotiated well and gotten lucky. Gerald was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Robert would be proud of you, Margaret." I hoped that was true. I hoped Robert could see, wherever he was, that I'd finally learned the lessons he'd been trying to teach me. That real wealth wasn't in accumulation but in circulation. That money was only valuable when it served purposes larger than itself. That the best inheritance we could leave wasn't property or investments, but the values that shaped how those things were used. October brought the kind of golden autumn days that make you grateful to be alive. Patricia and I walked every morning through neighborhoods painted in rust and amber. My book club read poetry, which I'd always found intimidating but was learning to appreciate. Sarah taught me to make sourdough bread, her patience with my failed attempts reminding me that some things were worth doing badly until you learn to do them well. And Michael continued to transform in ways both subtle and profound. He'd taken on a mentorship role at his company, helping younger employees navigate their careers. He'd started volunteering at a financial literacy nonprofit, teaching budgeting skills to people struggling with debt. He'd become someone who gave instead of only taking, who considered his impact on others, who measured success by different metrics than the ones that had driven him for so long. One evening in late October, Michael came by unannounced. He had something he needed to tell me, he said, and his face was serious in a way that made my heart clench with old fears. We sat at the kitchen table, our table where so much of this story had unfolded, and he took a deep breath. He said he'd been doing some research, trying to understand what had happened with the Riverside property. The timing had seemed too coincidental, losing the house right after that dinner, right after Jennifer's demand that I sell my home. He'd started investigating, pulling public records, tracing property ownership through layers of corporate entities. He'd found the trust. He'd found Robert's name. He'd found the connection between our family and the house he'd lived in for 3 years. My heart stopped. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. Gerald and I had been so careful. The revelation was supposed to come much later, after I was gone, part of the inheritance documentation that would explain everything. Michael looked at me across the table, and I couldn't read his expression. Was it anger? Betrayal? The old entitlement rising up again? Then he smiled, a sad, knowing smile that held no accusation. He said he understood now. He understood what I'd done and why. He understood that the house hadn't been random luck but a carefully constructed lesson. He understood that losing it had been the best thing that ever happened to him. He said he'd spent 2 years thinking I'd simply refused to help him when he needed it, thinking I'd been cold and distant and difficult. But the truth was so much more complicated, so much harder, so much more loving than he'd been able to see. I'd helped him by not helping him. I'd given him what he actually needed rather than what he thought he wanted. I'd loved him enough to let him struggle, to let him fail, to let him discover who he could become when comfort and entitlement were stripped away. He reached across the table and took my hand. He said, "Thank you, Mom. Thank you for not giving up on me. Thank you for believing I could be better than I was." We talked until well past midnight that night. I told him about Robert's letter, about the plan we'd made together, about the years of careful observation and difficult choices. I told him about the other properties, the trust that would eventually be his, the provision I'd added about affordable housing. I told him everything, holding nothing back, and felt the last weight of secrecy lift from my shoulders. Michael cried. I cried. We held each other the way we hadn't since he was a small child waking from nightmares, and I realized this was its own kind of awakening, from the nightmare of a life lived without purpose or meaning into something truer and more solid. Before he left that night, Michael said something I'll carry with me for whatever years I have remaining. he said. You gave me the greatest gift anyone ever could. You gave me the chance to become someone I could respect. Someone Dad would have been proud of. Someone I'm proud to be. Now it's been 3 years since that terrible dinner, and my life looks much the same from the outside. Same modest house, same faded curtains, same creaking porch. But everything has changed in the ways that matter. Michael is remarried now, to Sarah, in a simple ceremony in my garden with the hydrangeas in full bloom. They bought a small house they can actually afford, and they're talking about children. Michael still visits every Sunday, but now Sarah comes too, and sometimes Patricia joins us, and my kitchen fills with laughter and conversation and the kind of warmth that has nothing to do with wealth or status or impressive addresses. Gerald tells me the trust is performing well, that when the time comes, Michael will inherit more than he expects. But more importantly, he'll inherit it as someone who understands what money really means, what it's for, how to use it wisely and generously. He'll inherit it as the man Robert hoped he'd become. I'm 69 now, and I think about mortality more than I used to. But I'm not afraid. I've done what I needed to do. I've raised a son who lost his way and found it again. I've honored my husband's wishes and wisdom. I've learned that standing firm in your values, even when it hurts, even when you're not sure, is its own kind of strength. Sometimes in the evenings, sitting on my porch with a cup of tea, I swear I can feel Robert beside me. Not a ghost exactly, but a presence, the accumulated weight of a life well lived together, of lessons learned and passed on, of love that doesn't end just because the body does. And I think about all the people who'll never know this story: Jennifer, with her new wealthy husband and her restored lifestyle, the teacher family, now raising their children in a house they think they simply got lucky finding, the young people Michael mentors who don't know their teacher once had to learn these same hard lessons. That's okay. The best kinds of love often work quietly, invisibly, asking nothing for itself. The best kinds of strength don't announce themselves with boldness but persist through ordinary days and difficult choices and the slow, patient work of becoming who we're meant to be. My house is still modest. My life is still simple. But I'm rich in all the ways that actually matter. In love earned back, in values upheld, in the quiet certainty that when my time comes, I'll leave behind something more valuable than properties or investments. I'll leave behind a son who knows what it means to struggle and grow, who understands that character matters more than comfort, who'll take what he's been given and use it to help others find their own way home. And really, what greater wealth could any mother hope to leave her child? The hydrangeas are blooming again this year. Heavy and blue and beautiful. Robert's hydrangeas still here, still thriving, still reminding me every summer that some things, love, growth, second chances, are patient enough to outlast any winter, no matter how cold or how long. I'm at peace. Finally, fully, completely at peace. And that, dear listener, is worth more than any house, any fortune, any perfectly curated life could ever be.